So in the Christian tradition, today is, in most of the Christian tradition anyway, today is known as Transfiguration Sunday. In some of the Christian churches, some of the Orthodox churches, Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox, it's not celebrated today. It's celebrated because they're on a different kind of calendar. In the future, probably about a month or so from now. But the story of the transfiguration of Jesus, we'll talk about that. I'm going to read about it in a minute, is an interesting one. And it's particularly interesting for us, even though we're not Christian, or maybe we are, some of you might be, but it's interesting because we need to figure out a way to personalize it, right? To make it our story. And so the story of Jesus' transfiguration appears in all three of the first four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all talk about it, and it actually falls somewhere right in the center of each of those Gospels, usually just before the period where Jesus is about to enter Jerusalem with his disciples during what is known as Holy Week, just before Easter, before his crucifixion and death and resurrection, right? And so this is from the Gospel of Mark. This is how he relates it. And they all relate it pretty much the same way. It says, after 6 days, Jesus took Peter and James and John with him. He's just been done preaching and teaching the people, doing the feeding of the 5,000. You know that story. And after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There, he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. So it's one of the really stranger stories in the Gospels, right? The stories about Jesus, because it's when you think about it, it's considered a miracle. The difference is that it's not a miracle that Jesus performed for someone else. It's a miracle that happened to Jesus, that he was transfigured in this way. And in the New Testament, the transfiguration of Jesus, it's an event, and he becomes radiant and glory on this mountain. In fact, there's a mountain, I think it's considered Mount Tabor is where it's traditionally been said to have happened there. And in these accounts, Jesus and 3 of his apostles, Peter, James, and John, go to the top of Mount Tabor and to pray. Jesus frequently did that, right? He took his disciples aside to pray. And he begins to shine, to glow with these rays of light. You get this, you've seen the images maybe of him standing there with the light shining out of his fingertips and his toes and light coming from his head. And his clothes are all white. And it's a major festival in Christian tradition in most churches. In the Greek Orthodox Church, the event is called the Metamorphosis, not the Transfiguration. You know that word, metamorphosis, right? It means to be totally changed. But as I said, most of these stories in the Christian scriptures, as in other sacred texts, shouldn't be taken as a literal event. It's a story. It's a myth, something that never was but that is always happening. Remember, I've used that phrase before. It's a metaphor for our own possibility, just as in a few weeks we'll read again about the metaphor of possibility offered by the story of the death and resurrection at Easter time. The word metamorphosis comes from the Greek meaning a transforming, a transformation, from metamorphun, or to transform, from meta, which means change, and morphe, which means shape, to change shape or to change form. So what happened to Jesus in that story is that he became an entirely different kind of being, if you will. And then we have the word metamorphosis, meaning in the biological sense of an extensive transformation that an animal, especially an insect, undergoes after it leaves the egg. You remember when you were a kid in school and the teacher brought in a glass tank with some branches in it, right? And on one of those was a cocoon, or maybe there was a caterpillar, right? And everybody had fun watching the caterpillar, eating the leaves and all that stuff. And eventually that caterpillar would make a cocoon and wrap itself up in the cocoon. And it just stayed there for a while. And over the period of time that it took to do that, every day you'd come in and you look in the tank and see what was going on, and you see that it was making the cocoon, and you were fascinated by it, right? You were a little kid, what's going on here? And then you watched it over a longer period of time, and suddenly the cocoon was done, but it just sort of sat there. Nothing happened. And you were wondering, well, what's gonna go on now? And at some point, that cocoon, which was in its chrysalis stage at that point, the cocoon starts to move a little bit and it starts to break open. And eventually what happens, not a caterpillar, but something different comes out of that cocoon, right? And it comes out and it's a butterfly, and it sits on the branch and it gradually opens its wings, and those wings dry out, and there it is, a whole new creature from that cocoon. That's metamorphosis. It was amazing to us as children, right? It's still amazing to me. It was a mystery, and it's still a mystery how that happened, right? Now, over the years, scientists and entomologists who study butterflies, by the way, did you know you may know this, how many of you know what a person who studies butterflies is called? A lepidopterist. That's what those scientists are called, a lepidopterist. They've developed ways with the technology they have today to actually see what's happening inside the cocoon as the caterpillar develops into that butterfly. It used to be that they didn't have a way. They would have to, unfortunately, cut open the cocoon to see what was going gradually on. And a lot of those butterflies never came to be. But even with all of that technology now, the actual process, it's still a mystery. So there's a total transformation that happened there. The author, Richard Rohr, he says that the word change normally refers to new beginnings, but transformation, the mystery that we're talking about, more often happens not when something new begins, but when something old changes or falls apart, right? And that's the lesson that we're going to have to take from this transfiguration of Jesus. Now, Jesus didn't fall apart, but he did change. And we try to do all we can to keep things from changing most of the time, to keep things from falling apart. We talk about how a lot of times how we're just trying to keep it all together. But the pain of something old falling apart calls us to listen at a deeper level. It invites us, and sometimes it even forces us to go out to a new place, spiritually, because the old place is falling apart. It forces us into a change that we weren't necessarily ready to do, or that we were afraid of doing. Otherwise, many of us would never go to new places, right? I'm kind of okay sometimes with the way things are, even though they may be uncomfortable. And doing that isn't easy, because we desperately try to hold on to the old, because it's where we feel safe and comfortable, even if it's painful. We do all we can to keep it together. Pema Chodron, the Buddhist teacher, talks about this in her book, which is appropriately titled When Things Fall Apart. She says this: things falling apart is a kind of testing and also a kind of healing. We think that the point is to pass the test or to overcome the problem, but the truth is that things really don't get solved. They come together and then they fall apart. They come together again and then they fall apart again. It's just like that. Nothing ever goes away until it has taught us what we need to know. Nothing ever really attacks us except our own confusion. Perhaps there's no solid obstacle except our own need to protect ourselves from being touched. Maybe the only enemy is that we don't like the way reality is now, and therefore we wish it would go away fast. But what we find is that nothing ever goes away until it has taught us what we need to know. If we run 100 miles an hour to the end of the continent in order to get away from the obstacle, we find the very same problem waiting for us when we arrive. It just keeps returning with new names, new forms, manifestations, until we learn whatever it has to teach us about where we are separating ourselves from reality. Transformation usually includes some sort of disorienting or disconcerting reorientation, right? Think about how those disciples felt when they were on top of that mountain. The section of the Christian scriptures that I read from Mark, his version of the story, it says that Peter didn't know what to say. So he said, hey, let's set up these tents, if you will, these shelters, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. Good idea, right, Lord? And that's related in all three versions of the story. But Luke, or Matthew rather, Matthew says that they were kind of sleepy, the disciples. And Peter didn't really even know what he was saying. It also says that a cloud enfolded them. So they were disoriented. They really had no idea what was going on. So they were disoriented by this change, this event that was happening. Think about how that caterpillar feels when it's going through all that, right? There's an old Sufi story about a stream in the desert that talks about this kind of change, this kind of disorientation we feel. And it says this, it says, in the distance, high at the top of an ancient mountain range, a stream sprang from its hidden source and made its way down the mountainside. No obstacle could keep it from moving. On top, underneath, around, and through it traveled, sometimes flowing furiously, other times drifting lazily, but never once stopping in its forward motion. When it reached the earth, it didn't slow down. It traveled merrily for time out of mind, bubbling and burbling and babbling as only a brook can. Many creatures refreshed themselves in its water, and it renewed the earth and washed the stones clean. As it journeyed along, it felt as though its quest would never end, just as it had seemingly never begun. Eventually, however, the strength of the stream lessened. Its flow began to slow, and its cleansing power and attraction to the animals began to diminish. Gone were the trees and the mountains that had long been its companion, and even the earth it traveled traveled on seemed to become drier and less dense. It could feel a great stagnant heat burning its back and stealing its essence ounce by ounce as it tried in vain to move forward. "What is happening?" it asked. "What is this vast sea of dry death? Why can I not cross you? I must move forward too, or I will die. Movement is both my function and purpose in life. Just as the sky has the earth, so too do you have your opposite," came the answer. "You are water. I am the desert. We cannot coexist." The stream was distraught, but it refused to give up. Conjuring its strength, it surged forward from behind, lurching further out onto the desert floor than it had ever done before. But the desert was vast and far more powerful. Between the sun and itself, it wasn't long before it had eaten up all of the stream's new waters, sighing with a dry, deep laugh as it did so. "The waves of the mountain will not work here," it said. "I am an obstacle of a different caste, far more ancient than any you've ever encountered before. It will take much more than that to cross me." The story goes on to say how the water kept trying to move forward, and it couldn't do it. It says, just as it had given up, however, something caught its awareness. The winds were stronger today than they had been for weeks, and there was a dune in the distance that was losing some of its sands to them. The stream watched as the dust swirled into the sky, relinquishing itself to an invisible force that was as powerful as it was deceptive. As it looked on, a whisper began to stir the earth and air around it, speaking in a tongue that was both foreign and intimately familiar. "Surrender," came the voice, and with this revelation, the stream could sense the desert stir in an uncomfortable yet acknowledging manner. But the tiny stream was afraid, pushing forward with all it knew. Gravity was its keepsake and its oldest friend. The ways of the wind could not be trusted. Though it surely died 1,000 deaths at the foot of the desert, at least it continued to live. The wind could mean its end forever. "This is the risk," the desert laughed. "Do you trust enough, little stream?" The wind picked up. The stream could feel its cooling presence on its back, its promise of lightness and release to the skies above. Such a difference from the stagnant hell of the desert. And a longing began inside of it to let go, but it was terrified. It could not bear the thought of non-existence. And the wind speaks to the stream, and it says, "There are lands far across the desert where I will drop you once again, if only you come with me. There you will be a stream and flow once more." "But what if I'm not the same stream? How can I be sure?" The wind said nothing, but continued only to coax more of the stream into its embrace, imparting its images. The stream trembled and shook, but it could hold on no longer. Finally, it gave the fullness of its body to the sky, and upon doing so, was flooded with the distant memory dream of a stream it may once have been, and a wind that could be trusted, and lands so different they could not possibly be real, but that somehow it seemed to know. And as it evaporated, soaring high above the hot white sands, it could sense the desert smile as it had so many times before, and eventually it came to be released softly on the top of a distant mountain, where once again it began its flow. And here in this new land, the stream finally began to understand what it really was. Change of itself just happens, right? But spiritual transformation has to become an actual process of letting go, living in that confusing mystery, that dark space we talk about sometimes for a while, and allowing ourselves to be changed, to be taken to a different place. Remember the story of Jonah in the belly of the great fish. I know some people say it's a whale, but the Bible doesn't say that. It says great fish. He was swallowed up. Actually, he surrendered himself. He knew that he was on that boat trying to escape God because he didn't want to go to Nineveh to prophesy against the people of Nineveh. And he was trying to escape, and the boat came into a storm, and they didn't know why. They were going to crash and all die. And Jonah said, no, it's my fault. Throw me overboard. So they threw him overboard, and he got swallowed by the great fish and spit up on a new land. And that land happened to be Nineveh, where he didn't want to go. Transfiguration, change happens on personal levels and on corporate levels, meaning in congregations, among families, among nations. We see that happening now. Sometimes that change is very painful, and it requires strength to get through. Because transformation and change is all about relation. It's relational. How we relate to each other, how we relate to the world, how groups of people relate to each other. The Reverend Naomi King writes this. She says, transformation is life. We cannot pretend that it is not so. We can hold on to denial and hold on to rage and hold on to bitterness and hold on to the illusion that somehow we are exempt from change or as perfected as we are going to be. But then the breaking comes, as it inevitably does. Transformation happens because it is part of life, no matter what we try, deny, or do. We do not get to choose a lot of the change that life brings, but we can choose how we adapt to and learn from the changes they bring. We can transform for bitter or for better, for sickness or for healing, for fearfulness or for generosity, for anger or for kindness, for willful ignorance and hatred, or for wonder and wisdom. Let's transform for wonder and wisdom, and for peace and for love. May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.